upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. Would you join me in welcoming Ross?
Well, good morning, everybody. Day 4. And it's interesting now, the title here, somebody says, what was it? Well, it is sleep, of course. So we are going to talk about sleep. We've talked about sort of the broad issues related to health and some of the issues that we have in terms of even our society's ability through the systems that we have to manage our health, which is a crisis. And then we talked about some of the nutritional elements and hopefully some of the foundational principles that'll give us not just the knowledge, but hopefully the understanding to give us the ability to make choices that are actually healthy. And then yesterday we talked about physical activity. So physical activity, the body needs nutrition, what you put into it, and it is true. What you put into it ultimately is what makes you. And then the second, you need to move the body, it needs to be used, and very true, unless you use it, you do lose it. It's the same with the brain, and it certainly accelerates that loss as you get older, but you don't have to. And so we talked about that yesterday. And then the concept of sleep, so what it is, and it was for many years nobody knew what sleep really did, just that you didn't feel so good if you didn't get enough. And eventually, in fact, I think, does anybody know how long somebody has gone without sleep? It's been a number of days, I think 6 days, something like that. There might be longer, particularly if you were being tortured, but as far as people doing it experimentally, I think it's about that long. And you certainly end up with all sorts of issues if you move down that path. We do need sleep, and we need it for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons that you need sleep for is, of course, if you get good sleep at night, then it prevents you from sleeping when you shouldn't. Is that fair enough? And I've got to tell you a very poor joke, and it might not actually, anyway, I hope it actually has some relevance. But anyway, it was just a young man was overheard saying he would like to die in his sleep like his father, rather than yelling and screaming like everybody else in the car. Anyway, hopefully if you're getting enough sleep, you won't be going to sleep at the wrong times. And clearly that would be a wrong time, and so it's a little bit of a dark joke. But so sleep, why do we need it and how do we get enough? Let's see if I can do the right thing by this. Pick up being at the back. Okay, so a little bit of science to begin with. And the reason why the science is necessary is that it gives you a sense of, well, gee, that's actually how we actually respond, and that's what the brain needs, and that's what the body is doing when it sees different things. So there's a little part in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, sits sort of in the middle of the brain, as you can see there. It gets information from light from the eyes. So one of the things that are really important if you want to get your biorhythms into a nice set pattern is you make sure that you get light at the right times. So waking up early in the morning, not burning your eyeballs with the sun as we do every time we sit out at Scott's Head and the sun's up, but you just get light in the morning, early as possible. That'll wake the body up. It actually sends signals through to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the cells that are back there, through the optic nerve, and it actually stimulates them and go, whew, this is daytime. And away you go. Now that's great, because later on in the afternoon, the sun's starting to go down, and ultimately you're not getting as much stimulation through, again, that part of the brain, through the optic nerve. However, if you go home, and we'll talk about it a little bit more at night, later, but if you go home and then you're on some kind of media which has a lot of blue light, and there's blue light filters, as we know, but if you're getting that stimulation during the night, it's going to confuse your biorhythms. So we receive information, light from the eyes, synchronizes with some of the neuronal clocks. So the body has a lot of biorhythms. Not sure how important these are. But metabolically, we have biorhythms that are switched on and switched off by different things that are happening. So light, very important one. So it goes through the clocks, different tissues, different organs, because the body is a major factory. We literally do different things metabolically in the morning to what we're doing even in the early afternoon, to what we're doing in the later afternoon, to what we're doing in the evening. So we want all of that synchronized, and this is a really important part or important start to that synchronization. It's actually that early light, the blue light in the morning. Just because I can't help it, NAD, how many people are in the NAD study, by the way? Okay, fantastic. Don't forget tomorrow morning, fasted, come to us somewhere between 7 and ideally 9, and bring your paperwork. So NAD is actually a molecule which we'll be testing on these people who have joined up for the study, but it's the one that actually drives these biological clocks. So as I mentioned, that suprachiasmatic nucleus, about 20,000 neurons sitting in the middle of the brain, and the NAD's got to go up and down depending on the time of day, and it helps to circulate. There's a bunch of chemistry behind all of that, but the levels of NAD are actually important, so those people in the study will actually know what their levels are. And we collect everybody in the morning because we want them at that phase. All right, I won't say any more about that one. But if you want to increase your NAD just in case, you can get it from either tryptophan, vitamin B3, which is the nicotinic acid version. There's a nicotinamide version. Has anybody heard of any of these? Nicotinamide riboside? Some people might have, if you're looking in the literature, particularly around the sort of longevity literature, that type of thing. And there's another one called nicotinamide mononucleotide. I know I'm being recorded on this, so let me go on record by saying I'm not necessarily enthusiastic about the last two. People make a lot of money out of them, and I'm not sure that they're any better than the first two, which are relatively cheap. Anyway, what is sleep? So it starts with the brainstem. Some people will call this like the reptilian brain, but that's an evolutionary connotation. Just the brainstem controls the sleep-wake cycles, or the transition through to sleep. And interesting, there's a molecule called GABA. It stands for GABA-aminobutyric acid. And it's actually a molecule which the body makes. It's a neurotransmitter. You can also, actually, depending on the types of foods you eat and the culturing of the type of bacteria that you've got within your gut, the gut can actually produce quite a bit of GABA. So it can actually be an important one, and that's why sometimes having a healthy, or at least the health of the gut, can play a significant role even into the feelings of anxiety. So let me just tell you something about GABA. The brain likes to have, and look, there's over 100 different types of neurotransmitters, but these are two main ones. There's one called glutamate, or a class of receptors called glutamate, and glutamate is one of the neurotransmitters. And so it actually stimulates the brain, actually mostly around the brain. The brain does funny things. It can stimulate some areas and downregulate others. But anyway, generally, it's what we call an excitatory neurotransmitter. And then you have GABA, GABA-aminobutyric acid. It's actually your inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it slows things down. The brain likes to, and the body overall, likes to switch things on and then have things that switch things off. So glutamate switches things on, lots of activity going. GABA actually slows it down. So it's sensible that GABA would actually, when GABA starts going up, that's actually putting you into more of a sleep state, reducing your arousal. Now, for those that might be interested how alcohol works, alcohol actually what we call potentiates or makes the GABA receptor function a little bit more efficiently. Does that make sense? So effectively, when you take alcohol, that's ethanol, when you take alcohol, it actually stimulates, or it potentiates the GABA receptor. So it actually makes the GABA receptor work more effectively. And it starts from the back through to the front. So you start losing coordination and things like that before you actually start losing frontal lobe activity. But that's ultimately, the more you increase, the more GABA affects, and ultimately then it slows you down. So alcohol can actually help you go to sleep, which is why a lot of people will do the nightcap. The only trouble is that GABA, or at least alcohol, when it activates, is what we call a neuroactive depressant. It will actually activate some of the pathways that are linked through to depression. So not a particularly good thing. Also high levels of oxidative stress as a result. But GABA there, it slows down the arousal centers, sends signals to relax to the muscles. So hopefully you're not acting out your dreams. I mean, there's a very special links through to the frontal lobe which actually inhibits. So you can dream but you don't move. You are actually paralyzed. sometimes that can go a little bit awry and you might flail around or you might get up and walk. And there are some clinical conditions where people have that. So a little part called the pineal gland, most of you would have heard of that. It was thought to be the seat of the soul. Somebody famous once thought that. I'm not sure who it was anymore. But anyway, it's not. Receives signals from the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this is the part of the brain which is that clock part. And increases things like melatonin. So most of you have heard of melatonin. Yeah, so melatonin actually works quite well, and we can talk about it a little bit more later. But melatonin is one of those ones which should be increasing significantly, and the earlier you go to bed, the higher it gets. If you don't get to bed early enough, the peak is always lower. So melatonin, not only does it actually stimulate sleep initiation, but it's also a very powerful antioxidant. So it runs around in the body, and actually we think it actually has a very effective way of being able to mop up lots of free radicals, which might be developed as the body is actually using that night time. It's actually very active, the brain, during the night to actually clear away a lot of rubbish. So melatonin goes up that way. Now, as we get older, the pineal gland tends to produce less melatonin. Incidentally, you get melatonin from tryptophan as well. Did you know that? So tryptophan through to serotonin through to melatonin. But tryptophan also makes NAD. And NAD is extremely important. In fact, this was one of the first papers that I ever published in Journal of Neurochemistry, and it was just showing that basically if you've got a lot of free radical damage in brain cells, that the body switches on that pathway quite dramatically to produce NAD from tryptophan. And so it then inhibits the amount of serotonin you might be able to be produced, and then also potentially the amount of melatonin. So again, very important to keep nutrition up. So then you've got the little part in the front of the brain called the basal forebrain. Incidentally, the basal forebrain, you start losing most neurons in the context of Alzheimer's, both within the hippocampal region as well as in the basal forebrain, which is why people who are developing Alzheimer's tend to have sleep issues as well. And it releases a molecule called adenosine. Now, you might have remembered I mentioned that word before. Now, adenosine is needed for you to go to sleep. Now, it's interesting with adenosine. Caffeine actually counteracts sleepiness by blocking what's called adenosine receptors. So remember, I talked to you about ATP, so we all know that energy comes from the way we convert the food we've eaten this morning into adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine and 3 phosphates. When the body needs some energy, pulls off 1 phosphate, that's a high energy bond, you get energy. Needs another one, pulls off another one, and I can just go through all of it, pulls off the last one, it's left with adenosine. You feel tireder when you have adenosine going up, but adenosine then has to actually bind to, and there's 4 different types of receptors, but it's got to bind to those receptors, and it starts making you feel sleepy. That's a good thing. In fact, the other thing that adenosine receptors are is that at least 2 of them, we think probably 3, are associated with anti-inflammatory activity. So if you can activate your adenosine receptors normally, it has got an anti-inflammatory effect. Now, I'm saying that there's nothing wrong with any drink of any sort as long as it doesn't have caffeine in it, because caffeine blocks the adenosine receptor. So caffeine is blocking the adenosine receptor, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in relation to sleep a little bit later on. It's not surprising that we have more sleep problems now than we've probably ever had, because it can actually stop the body from doing what it normally does metabolically. Okay, so what happens when you sleep? Different stages of sleep, just very quickly. You've got the N1 stage, which is just that interim between consciousness and sleep, and probably another 10 minutes or so, many of you will be in that state. Okay, heart rate slows, brain does less complicated tasks. There may be some memory consolidation, you probably won't get to that here. And then once you get down to N3, the more deep sleep, body temperature and blood pressure decrease, and the body starts to repair itself. Now, I've just mentioned autophagy there, and that's literally, it's just getting rid of lots of rubbish that is around the body. And there's another term they call mitophagy, which is actually getting rid of things like mitochondrial proteins that have been damaged and actually getting rid of whole mitochondria. The brain particularly actually has another one, and it actually literally does a rinse cycle. at night. It's called through the glymphatics. It's a glymphatic rinse, if you like, and it does get rid of a lot of stuff. If you know anything about some of the pathology associated, and I'll mention Alzheimer's again, but other neurodegeneratives as well, it clears away some of those proteins that have built up that actually seem to be linked to some of the damage occurring in things like the neurodegeneratives, one of them being beta amyloid, and it certainly gets cleared during that time at night. And then you have this one, the REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, increase in eye movement, heart rate, breathing, blood pressure and temperature. Dreaming usually occurs, and this tends to be, you'll do it a few times at night, but tends to be a little bit more in the morning. So that cycle, for various different reasons, you cycle 3 to 5 times at night, going up and down through different ones of that, and that's a fairly normal looking cycle. So why do we need sleep? Well, here's a few things. We consolidate our memories. So what we've learned today, if you get a good sleep, you'll actually remember it. And not only will you remember it, but you integrate it with other information that you already have in the brain. If you don't get a good sleep, you won't remember it so well, and you won't actually consolidate it and link it to a lot of things. It won't be done nearly as effectively. So that's part of the learning, structural and physiological changes. Autophagy, I've mentioned already, getting rid of a lot of the rubbish, the build-up of toxins, etc. Now, it also helps to balance a lot of our hormones and immune system, and this is often, and even in this particular publication from the Annals of Neurology, talks about it that way. Those hormones and immune system, a lot of that is coordinated from the central nervous system. If the brain is actually healthy and happy, it is able to coordinate through the hypothalamus, the pituitary, etc., able to coordinate a lot more efficiently. If it doesn't get sleep, then a lot of that hormonal balance seems to be difficult to get. So poor sleep quality is associated with an increased risk of conversion for what we call mild cognitive impairment through to dementia. And the reason why I wanted to throw this out here, and again, I just want to remind you, the choices that we make, yes, they're our choices, and you can do whatever you want. But unfortunately, the results of those aren't optional. Does that make sense? You make choices, there are consequences, and the consequences are not optional. The consequences will come as a result of whatever choice you make. And as I might have mentioned, one of our major studies is in people with mild cognitive impairment, and we do want them to make significant changes because 80% of them will develop frank dementia. But we think that if you get that early enough, we can certainly prevent that trajectory. But if they choose not to do it, you can't do any more. You just have to step away and go, well, that's your choice. All right. So, okay, let me give you the whole lot here. So, just from the University of Chicago, just one particular study that came up. Group of students, asked them to sleep for only 4 hours a night for 6 consecutive days, and they noticed that their resting blood pressure went up, their stress hormone levels, including cortisol, goes up, number of antibodies to a flu vaccine, not that you would want them, but in any case they went down, so the immune system is not actually producing as much. Insulin resistance began to develop, and this is in relatively healthy people. And what was interesting here was that all the changes were reversed when the students made up the hours of sleep they had lost. So at least with the young population, it was possible to actually bring them back to a state of, well, equilibrium, hormesis, if you like. In the second study, they randomised 48 healthy adults, averaging 7 to 8 hours a night generally, to 3 groups. One had 8 hours, one had 6 hours, and one had 4 hours. And what was interesting, after 2 weeks, the 8 hours group, their reaction time and everything was normal, memory remained normal, cognitive activity remained normal. The 6 and 4 hour group, their reaction times in fact weren't much different to each other. Their memory decreased and their ability to perform on cognitive tasks all decreased. But what was significant about this is that those who got less sleep, the 6 and 4 hour group, were failing to engage how sleepy they really were. In other words, they'd got used to being sleepy, they'd got used to having less sleep, and they rated their performance pretty much the same as what they had before, going, yeah, I'm performing pretty well, even as the tests were showing that their cognitive performance was declining. So it's interesting. When you're chronically sleep deprived, you're not even able to tell. And there's probably, obviously there's some adaptive things with that, and so it's not necessarily not positive because there's a lot of reasons why people can't get good sleep. But just recognize that that's happening. So your ability to make decisions both in the home as well as professionally may not be particularly good if you're not getting regularly good sleeps. Okay, so what about some guidelines for sleep? Well, we do want 7 to 9 hours as ideal, preferably between the hours of 9 and 7 a.m. And again, I'm giving you the ideal. I know that there's a lot of difficulty. At least if you know what the ideal is, you can aim for it, even if you hit a little bit lower. And ideally, that's going to be unbroken. A couple of things about caffeine and sleep, and know that I'm talking about caffeine. I've got nothing against coffee and tea or Red Bull or anything like that. It's only caffeine that I have a concern with. So evening caffeine consumption, lengthened sleep latency, so basically harder to fall asleep. Caffeine produced similar effects in young and middle-aged subjects, but what was interesting here is, I think I mentioned yesterday, that caffeine actually reduces blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. It does it in young as well as in old. And I remember we've done a series of health studies on a whole range of different people, and one particular group was for it was the, and I won't mention the company's name, but they were executives for a prestigious car manufacturing company, and we did it on their executives for New South Wales. And it was interesting, once we'd finished doing all the assessments and the analysis, and I came back to give them a talk, and you probably had, I'd say probably 15 or 20 of these executives in a room. And, and I'm stepping through and giving them the talk as to how it all relates, and they had their reports with them. And, of course, I get to a caffeine part. Now, of course, what do, particularly marketing executives mostly do? Well, of course, there's a lot of caffeine. In fact, it's thought, and I haven't got in any of these presentations, but one of the things that it is thought that it increases your creativity. There's been at least 2 studies have shown that it actually decreases your creativity by taking caffeine. And part of that is because it reduces blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. And what I was saying to them, look, if they want to sell, and their cars are, like 200,000 plus, and I said, if you want to sell, one of your vehicles, one of the best things you could do is say to the guy who's coming in, look, come in at around about 10:30. He'll be desperate for a coffee by then, he or she. Get them in, tell them that you'll just have the best, drip coffee for them there. So, and make sure you do, so that they don't have to worry about it. Bring them in, give them that beautiful cup of coffee. They'll thank you for it. They'll think you're terrific. And you know that what will happen within that first half hour is you chat to them nicely, show them that beautiful car that they're going to spend a lot of money on, that their frontal lobe will start to shut down. And what they'll be left with is just the feelings. And that nice car sitting there, you're telling them how good it'll look when you drive out of here and how good it'll feel. What a sale. Easy. Anyway, they all laughed at that, but I think they thought it was a good idea. Anyway, the magnitude of reduction, total sleep, suggesting that caffeine taken anywhere close to 6 hours before bedtime had an important disruptive effect. So if you were going to use caffeine, then preventing or stopping using it at least 6 hours before your bedtime is important for maintaining some sleep hygiene. Refrain from substantial caffeine use for a minimum of 6 hours prior to bedtime. And what I was going to mention with the previous slide was it actually affects the middle-aged and older brain more than a younger brain. So the younger brain, it still shuts down frontal lobe activity. And listen, look, on a relative point of view, the young brain hasn't completely developed anyway, so frontal lobe activity is not great. So it probably has shut it down almost the same as what yours is when you take it. So anyway. So a couple of things with caffeine in adolescence. And look, the great thing is, not only am I a scientist and I don't have to be diplomatic, but I'm also now middle-aged. And it's great to be middle-aged because you can make references back to when I was a boy. And that's absolutely true. I didn't know anybody and went through a significant amount of our schooling through the state system, but and also the Adventist system, but didn't know anybody of my age who was having regular caffeine consumption or consumption of beverages with caffeine in them. And yet it's extremely popular now and very, very common. And yet I wonder whether it's a good idea. Just a couple of things here. So increased caffeine use in adolescence associated with later habitual bedtimes. I mean, it's hard enough to get to the bed already, and now they're going to bed later. And reduced, now this is some of the deep sleep, that's slow wave sleep. So because the deep sleep's involved in recovery processes during sleep, further research needs to understand whether caffeine-induced loss of sleep depth interacts with some of the neuronal networking. Particularly, as I mentioned in a previous talk, that there's 2 times when you've actually got what we call a synaptic explosion, so the brain's trying to wire itself dramatically. One was that first couple of years after the baby is born, and they're trying to sort of learn to walk and talk and understand what people are looking when they have certain facial expressions. And the other one is when they get to adolescence, and now they've got the secondary sex characteristics. The brain is developing and it's trying to wire the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex through to the hindbrain. And it's extremely important that that doesn't get disrupted. If we're putting stuff into the brain, and I think, and I've had this in public talks where I've spoken to groups of people, and you can see, you know, the number of people who are in the audience are introducing their child responsibly to alcohol at the ages of like 15, 16, etc. You know, we just let them have a little bit. Mate, I mean, at least in the US, it's illegal to have alcohol, I think, still till you're 21. We've allowed it at 18, which has just been madness, in my opinion, because both caffeine and alcohol, even to more extent, can significantly affect the ability of the brain to wire. So this is just a little schematic, just showing the blue is actually a mature brain, and you can see, in fact, it doesn't really mature for men until at least 25, possibly 30. Women just a couple of years beforehand. But you can see that a young brain is there's lots of development that needs to happen. And a lot of those synaptic connections, that synaptic density, is not finished until way into their 20s. Yeah, and the frontal lobe develops last. So sleep changes as we age. We know that sleep may be broken, and many older people enjoy having a nap. Melatonin, sleep hormone produced by the circadian clock, by the pineal gland, gets less as you get older, so it may be harder to fall asleep. So why it's very important to have good sleep hygiene. Physical conditions commonly experienced in old age can affect sleep quality, whether or not it's restless legs or whether or not it's needing to hop up and do other things during the night, etc. And of course, this thing, stress, depression and anxiety, and obviously a link between all of those can affect sleep quality. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about stress and anxiety tomorrow, but one of the things to recognize, even with this, if you're stressed, melatonin was never designed in order to stop you or at least force you to go to sleep. When you're stressed, your stress hormones very easily override melatonin, even if you're taking supplemental melatonin. So getting stress levels down is actually one of the keys to improving things like sleep quality, over and above taking things like melatonin. So establishing a sleep schedule, set aside no more than 9 hours for sleep. Try to go to bed and get up at the same time every day, preferably between the hours of 9 and 7. As I said, this is working towards the ideal. And it is important, be consistent. If you can get into a routine, the body likes it because it doesn't have to think about it. So you get into a routine and then the body just naturally wants to do it this way. It's very hard to keep me awake after 9 o'clock. And especially, I mean, I hate evening meetings. When somebody wants to put on a meeting sometime and they go, "You'll be free around 8:30? Well, no. I'll probably be in bed. So, yeah, very important to be consistent. If you don't fall asleep in 20 minutes, leave your bedroom, do something else relaxing, whether or not it's going out, reading a book, whatever it is. Don't go and eat or drink or even chew chewing gum. One of the things that I've done within the hospital environment is went through and how to shift your biorhythms, because people who are on night shift, that's particularly difficult. Or particularly important. And you can actually get them to shift their biorhythms in a way which ultimately can make that healthy. But then they have to sort of shift out of it again fairly soon. So shift work is really fraught. But the thing with keeping your rhythm happening, if it's not for some reason working while you're in bed, don't just stay in bed and feel stressed and frustrated. Because what that seems to do is set up kind of a psychological association that bed is a place for feeling frustrated, and every time I lie down, I know I'm not going to go to sleep. Get up. Go and do something else. Usually it'll be reading in a corner somewhere where you haven't got, if you can get sort of a yellowish light, that's a good thing. Something that's not as bright. And wait till you fall asleep. I mean, I was going to say, if you want some reading material to put you to sleep, I've got a thesis that you would probably enjoy. It's a great way of putting sleep. And it's so disappointing because we spend so much time on it and we just think that it's such great work. But anyway. When you're feeling tired again, go back to bed and just hopefully it'll all happen. So be mindful what you eat and drink, and when, avoiding eating 3 hours before bedtime. You've got to give your tummy time to relax. And going 3 hours before bedtime and hopefully not having had a full meal or a heavy meal, the body it is in a much better state to be able to relax, and you will actually go into that nice cycle of sleep. And I understand it's difficult, but I don't make the rules. I just hopefully recognize them and then can tell you more about it, and your choice what you do with it. Nicotine, caffeine and alcohol we've mentioned. Careful of how much liquid you consume before bedtime. Well, that just makes sense. Creating a sleep zone, so ideal room for sleeping in a cool, dark and quiet place. And consider using room darkening shades, earplugs or a fan. Good. And as I mentioned, removing technology. So very popular, obviously, to have technology in the evening. I remember a particular lady who was part of one of our studies that we were doing with cognitive impairment, an older lady, and she was just saying that this was the only time she could actually relax enough to be able to do her emails and catch up with all the, Facebook family and everybody. And she was doing that at night, but having terrible difficulty getting to sleep. And, we talked about it. We, gave her as much advice and encouragement. But in the end, she just stuck to doing it. And sadly, she didn't improve. And unfortunately, the consequences are still there. Okay, so minimize evening blue light. We've talked about that already. It certainly disturbs the biorhythms. Mobile phones, computers, TVs, we've talked about. Doing some reading, great way of being able to slow down. And depends on what you like to read. Most people won't find themselves going into a sleepy state if they're reading a horror novel. No, we bought a book yesterday, just from the ABC, and it was of a particular family who had gone through some of the atrocities through some of the political history in Romania. And I tell you what, it wouldn't be a book I would want to read at night. I mean, it certainly gets your heart racing and you think, ooh, wow. But for me, philosophy, I really enjoy reading that kind of thing. It just kind of relaxes me and my mind kind of ticks over on it. But other people will have another thing. I've got a friend of mine who's a mathematician who loves doing sort of complex Sudoku just before going to bed. And it's a great way for them. But for most people, it'll actually be really quite stimulating. So find something that you enjoy. And limit the daytime naps. So as you get older particularly, and if you're not sleeping particularly well at any age, there is always the temptation to want a nap. And I know traveling internationally and across time zones, what I try and do there is definitely not sleep when I get to wherever I'm going. I try and stay awake until what would be the normal time for sleeping in their time zone. And look, it's pretty terrible, and often I'll get there only because I'm usually cheap and I don't want to spend too many nights in a hotel before the conference. I'll get there as the conference is there, and I'll find myself having to just walk around literally just to stay awake in order to finish the conference. And then, you go to sleep that night. By the third night, you're feeling pretty good because you've adapted. But you can do that here as well. So sleeping too much in the afternoon is not good. Physical activity, always linked to better quality of sleep, though if you do too much physical activity, because the body is actually in a state of disrepair, you've actually damaged a lot of the joints and muscles, it might be more difficult. So don't overdo it, but exercise tends to always give you an improvement in being able to sleep. So don't exercise vigorously also close to bedtime. So we talked about that yesterday, and ideally it's still the sort of 6 to 6. You can go earlier. I mean, probably, 5 o'clock, not a bad time to start exercising if you're an early riser. But trying to finish before 7 is probably ideal. Light walk after dinner, always helpful. That actually assists with some of the digestion, gets rid of any sugar spikes particularly that might be happening, and some of the lipid spikes too, if you're lucky. Now this last one, I feel almost it's a bit of a motherhood statement, and I'm not here to tell you something which is pretty obvious to all of you. And managing worries, it almost seems trite when I put it up. It's not my intention to be that way, and I recognise that people have some really significant things that they've got to deal with. But resolving those concerns as best as possible and recognising that you probably can't do anything more this afternoon. Yep, if you need to jot them down, just leave it. And leave it in God's hands. Casting all your care upon him because he does care for you. All of us have had some significant things to worry about, I'm certain of that, and even in more recent times. But that is something that I know my Creator can handle it. And ultimately, between the two of us, we'll solve it as time goes on. If you're having more difficulty, there are some other things that you can do to assist. So as I mentioned, melatonin is not a bad supplement. You can you certainly buy it over the counter in the US, no problem, or off the shelf. It is. So it's a Schedule 3. Yeah, so your pharmacist can provide it for you. Okay, so over the counter you can get it. And melatonin, it's good to have that kind of barrier because if you take too much melatonin, you really only need 1 or 2 micrograms. And that's how much the body produces normally. And most people, you can easily get 5 and 10 microgram tablets. It's really important that you don't overdo it because the body becomes less sensitive to it, even to your own body's production of melatonin. So reducing that potentially. And recognize that melatonin won't override your stress. So your stress will override your melatonin. So you've got to deal with that on its own. But it can be quite helpful. Doesn't also replace good sleep habits. That's necessary. It'll facilitate falling asleep. Yep. Can be compromised. Herbal teas. Chamomile. Now, chamomile actually increases GABA. So it's one of those ones which can be helpful in that regard. There's a few of them. I remember having some students that I actually reviewed their thesis from the University of Sydney, pharmacy students who are doing a series of works on different teas and their production of different neurotransmitters which might have played a role in this. Chamomile was certainly an effective one. Doesn't work for everybody. Hops is another one that works quite well. And there's a few others. Being conscious of the liquids before bedtime, of course, as well. And there's also a few vitamins and minerals, and this is going to be my last slide, so let me go through it relatively shortly. So few teas around that might be useful. Sleep habits are particularly important, and some of these. So magnesium, as I mentioned previously, inhibits what we call the NMDA receptor. So that's a glutamate subtype receptor, which is a main excitatory receptor used in excitation of neurons and those excitatory pathways. Magnesium actually sits in the middle of that. Now, as you get older, a lot of people will actually be what we would call functionally magnesium deficient. So it's not bad to actually take some supplemental magnesium. And it's not particularly, it's hard to overdose, I think I mentioned the other day. So not bad to have it. Vitamin D3, again, is being linked. There's a number of receptors for vitamin D and pathways linked through to particularly melatonin production. So good to have good levels of vitamin D. And I've given a suggestion there. So folate. Now, most of us, if we're eating commercial breads and grains, folate won't be an issue because we supplement those. But if not, if you want to get folate, where would you get it from naturally? Foliage. So folate comes from foliage. A lot of green stuff. Basically, just get lots of greens in. You get lots of vitamin K2 from there as well, so it's pretty good. And also calcium, so great mix. Vitamin B12, another one. So you need vitamin B12, so a number of these are actually used also for synthesizing some of the neurotransmitters. And in the case of B12, yeah, you need it also for things like serotonin and dopamine and melatonin, etc. So making sure that you have enough B12. Now, I've been a vegan for, well, probably at least 20 years, and certainly a vegetarian for a lot longer than that. I do relatively, well, occasionally get my B12 done, and it always seems to be okay. So I may be one of those people that don't have an issue, but there are also many people that we've even tested over the years who are significantly low in their B12. And it is well worth, and there's a lot of argument as to how much B12, what your levels really need to be, whether or not it's truly at 120 or 150 or over 200. I would argue certainly over 200. And certainly one conference I went to and spoke with some considerable time to the scientist from Oxford, and he would argue that you need to be over the 350 mark in order not to see functional. He says that he can measure differences in terms of some of the metabolic activity with having a B12 lower than that. Now, it doesn't hurt you to be that high, so there's nothing irresponsible with even taking a little bit more B12. As far as we know, there is not really any known toxicity that I know of. If anybody else does, let me know. So supplementing is not a bad idea. And I should mention with B12, if you decide to do it, my recommendation would be either using a hydroxycobalamin or a methylcobalamin, not a cyanocobalamin. Most of the ones that you'll buy off the shelf in most of the pharmacies, the cheapest one will be a cyanocobalamin, and that just means that the B12 is the cobalamin bit, and cyano is just a cyanide. So basically a cyanide attached to B12. And we published a paper, I think it was back in 2014 or 15, I can't remember, but we'd looked at the effect of B12 within the brain along with a number of other things. And there seemed to be a link, or at least a potential link, which is what we argued, with the amount of cyanocobalamin some people would be supplementing with. So the body actually gets rid of cyanide very easily, so you're not doing any problems with that, and we saw very healthy. But in the brains of people who were likely to be supplementing with significant amounts of cyanocobalamin, they actually had an increase in oxidative damage for people who were taking B12 or had levels of B12 at that height. And we argued that it could have been the cyano, and I did the calculations to show that you could probably generate enough to do damage within the brain. So anyway, it's just a little caveat. Probably taking the hydroxy and methyl would be best. B6, another one which lots of people are low in. I mean, B6, you get it in, sweet potato. You also get it in a lot of greens. You get it, if you're basically doing whole foods, you'll get your B6. Good stuff in avocados, so B6 is in avocados as well. But lots of people are also low in it because there's a lot of people who aren't eating that much whole foods. And it's fairly easy in our given society not to eat much whole food. So and B6 is not usually supplemented. But notice that it's needed in order to make things like GABA. It's also needed for things like dopamine, that's part of the reward pathways, serotonin, associated with a variety of different things, including mood, as well as melatonin and noradrenaline. So you do need B6. It's a cofactor that sits in a number of different places. In fact, you need it to make even NAD or vitamin B3. So B6 you can overdose on. So you don't want to be taking too much. Vitamin B1, we just mentioned it yesterday when it came to B1 and keeping the mozzies away. As far as I'm aware, you can't overdose on it, so getting the occasional good one is probably a good idea, but also necessary for even some of the neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. B2, again, needed for energy, and B3, as I've mentioned, needed to make NAD. So we've pretty much given you a list of a general B vitamin supplement. But the important thing is all of them have a link to some of the pathways that are associated with helping the body produce the right kind of neurotransmitters, even the right kind of hormones at the right time. And surprisingly, and I'd say particularly as we get older, but I would argue even for a lot of younger people, there seems to be a deficiency of at least some of those in the diets of most. That'd be my argument. All right. Okay, that's not where we needed to go. Don't think Eugen is taking questions. Okay, so we've got a few minutes this morning. So if there is questions, happy to take those. Yes, Nikki. That's a really good question. I don't have anything specific on that, and I wouldn't have. So you wouldn't need to take a slow release if you're only taking probably less than the 5 micrograms. And I know that there may be benefit to taking slow release for people who need to sort of have it sort of leached out over the evening. But I would be more, for me personally, if I'm overseas and wanting to sort of kick my sleep off, I will take a small amount, about a half hour to 1 hour before I actually want to sleep. And it seems to work so well. So I can't help you any more than that. Yeah. Calcium's necessary for sleep, but you get calcium from a lot of places. So generally, the body, you wouldn't need to supplement, I would think. I think people supplement possibly too much with calcium. I think the issue, and that's particularly with the bones, when the body needs calcium, it'll actually take it from the bones. Now, you don't want to be osteoporotic, but if you've got lots of greens in the diet and you're having different seeds and grains, that you shouldn't have a problem with it. If somebody is finding it necessary to supplement with their calcium, calcium is used in a huge range of different reactions, but the body is very good at being able to get the sources where it needs. So yes, to prevent things like osteoporosis, you would work more down that track, but generally speaking, it probably wouldn't promote sleep directly. Magnesium, yes, but not directly calcium. And I know it is in some formulae, but that's my view on it. Yeah, so that's a really good point. And in fact, if you are supplementing or want to supplement with some of the Bs, definitely do it in the morning before lunchtime. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Ross, you mentioned that you should limit sleep to 9 hours a day. What are the consequences of overindulging in sleep?
Yeah, so when people tend to, it has been linked with more psychological disorders in terms of particularly depression and things like that. So it has been found, there are some people, depending on their condition, if you've just had surgery, you might probably need about 12 hours sleep for a few days or even a couple of weeks. So the body does need it, but to actually keep having the body in a state where it's actually sleeping long periods, and it won't be good quality sleep, it seems to be linked more to some of the, particularly the affective disorders. So not a great idea to stay in bed. The body does need to get up and move. Yeah. Yeah. So ashwagandha was the first one. What was the other one? L-theanine. Yeah, so some people swear by L-theanine, and there is some good literature around it. Ashwagandha too, there is literature around that. Some of those studies are published in journals that aren't necessarily high impact. I'm a little bit skeptical. If it works for you, I think use it. And different people just try different things, and ultimately they settle on something that works. It's not a pure science for this one. And again, the L-theanine, yes, potentially it can be useful, particularly in relation to some of the neurotransmitters. But again, I think try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, yeah.
Ross, what would you say is the ideal ratio for B3 to B6?
So the ratio of B3, so it's not so much a ratio in that context, it's really whether or not you've got enough on board, because they're driving different pathways. So you definitely need B6, and I would be thinking, if you're taking a sort of 40 milligram supplement a day, then that's fairly safe, and that'll keep you in a relatively good space. When it comes to the B3 is driving a couple of different pathways that are linked to each other, but B3, again, in terms of precursor, and if you just take nicotinic acid, that would be in around about 250 milligrams a day with something like nicotinic acid. And that will keep you, ultimately your NADs will be up at a level which will actually support not only the generation of the various pathways here, including NAD, but also a bunch of other pathways as well, with repair pathways. And yeah. So somebody's doing night shift for a week. How long does it take before they then perform optimally, or being on night shift? Look, and it happens in the healthcare industry. There's very few industries that are as bad as the healthcare industry, and right across the professions because of the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week care that's necessary. Yeah, it's a really difficult one. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I've wanted to do it particularly on some of the residents. And particularly in the old days, the residents were actually treated relatively badly. It would have been, and there's no question that their cognitive performance is going to be significantly lower. And then staying awake with things like caffeine, and I remember having a talk with one of the, the head of the medical advisory committee. But anyway, we were chatting about the use of caffeine, and I was arguing that, it's better to stay awake by having to probably chew chewing gum and drink water, and I think your brain will actually function better than if you take caffeine. So caffeine reduces still. I mean, your brain is not working particularly well. You can perform in a mechanical way, so physically you can get up and move, but you won't actually think particularly well. If you drink, move and chew, so chewing gum can be effective, you will actually still have a better performing frontal lobe. So, yeah, you can't get away from the fact that, at night, and if you're being put on night shift, particularly if you haven't got into a biorhythm and allowed to stay, there's some permanent night shift people, and they can do it quite well. I know people that have done it for like 20 years, but they are in a definite rhythm. But when you're having to get up and do it on an occasion, there's no doubt you'll be performing less, and it does damage the body. It just does. Yeah.
Ross, you mentioned earlier in the week about within the immune talk, you mentioned natural killer cells, and I was interested to know just a little one-liner recap. Why is it important? What can we do to boost the natural killer cells, and what sort of protocols? You did allude to it, but what sort of protocols could we be taking which may actually impair the natural killer cell function?
Okay, so there's a little bit of a deviation. We might finish on this question. But so natural killer cells are necessary. They're your last line of defense, both for killing off, say, circulating tumor cells that might be in the body, which the body is producing on a regular basis. And they're also necessary for destroying, they're part of what we call the innate immune system that destroys things like viruses and that type of stuff which might be trying to get into the body. So in order to maintain natural killer cell function, there is a lot that we don't know about it, and that was why we were actually doing the study, because we wanted to learn a lot more about it. But there are some things known. So the first thing is, if you're stressed, natural killer cell function actually decreases. They're a pattern recognition cell, and so they tend to function less well within the context of things like cortisol. If you don't sleep so well, they don't work so well. They work well within the context of, so if your omega-3 is higher, but omega-3s, as I mentioned, we haven't talked about them very much, but omega-3s, in the same way that I talked about the brain likes to switch things on and switch things off with things like glutamate and GABA, well, in terms of inflammation, one of the main on switches for inflammation comes from the omega-6s. You get huge amounts of that within your diet. The main anti-inflammatory comes from the omega-3s, and you get very little of that within the diet. And the main reason for that is purely commercial, is that omega-6s are cheap to produce and they last long on the shelf. They don't oxidize. Omega-3s are expensive to produce and they oxidize very quickly, so their shelf life is short. So if you're producing a product and you wanted to put an oil in it, you will put an oil which has got lots of omega-6 in it. You just do. So you get lots of omega-6s, so lots of on-switch, not so much off-switch. So within the context of having inflammation, even though that's part of the immune system, the natural killer cell function, that pattern recognition, doesn't seem to work quite as well. it likes to have more omega-3 so that it's actually got a more balanced immune function. You can over-exercise and therefore reduce your natural killer cell function. As I mentioned the other day, that's generally not a risk for most people. And that's probably about as much as I can say. I mean, yes, high sugar, high fats are always going to suppress immune activity, and they will suppress things like natural killer cell function. Okay, well, look, we'll leave it there. And thank you, everybody. If I can just remind those people who are doing the NAD study, so tomorrow morning, just coming fasted. And all that means is, if you're going to come tomorrow at, say, 7:30, it just means finishing off your meal 7:30 tonight. If they see me now, yeah, they could. We'll just need to do their blood pressure before they come tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for the reminders and the education about the midnight munchies. I was recently pregnant. That was a real thing. Thank you for the reminder to bring the evening meal forward and possibly swapping it out with lunch as the main meal of the day. I also appreciated the reminder when I was lecturing at Avondale, my nursing students would stay up all night to cram before an exam, and that memory consolidation went out the window with what they were drinking to keep themselves awake. And while I am a new mum, I do think that catching up on emails while I'm feeding late at night is the only opportunity that I have. And now I realise why it's so hard to go back to sleep after I finished. Can I just share a story from experience? So I come from a haematology nursing background. I trained through Avondale and then I worked at Royal North Shore. While I was down there, nurses are shift workers. I appreciated your comment. That's what we had to do 4 compulsory nights out of the month. And I used Mocha. It's a chocolate and coffee blend to stay awake. I thought that it was keeping my patients safe and keeping me safe on the drive home. And while I was in my mid-20s, I went on a big health journey. And I came across the 8-week sugar-free challenge. I thought I'd do it. Sugar-free September sounded like a catchy title. And while I was taking stimulants out of my diet for a short period of time, I thought I should also take out coffee. I found myself concerned that I would make a medication error or that I would have a car crash on the way home. But I decided to give it a go. And so I swapped out my mocha for a herbal tea and fruit. So I would have watermelon, mangoes, I'd have peppermint teas, any kind of herbal tea. And I found myself safe on the way home. I also found it easier to fall asleep when I did get home, that the quality of my sleep was better and I was asleep for longer during the days on those night shifts. Because it worked and because I was safe as a clinician, I decided that if I got tired on the drive home, I'd just pull over. And so there was many a time when after, 20 minutes into the drive and the sun comes up and it's in your eyes and the car's warm, I just pull over and sleep. And then I continue driving on home after that. It felt good. And after a couple of weeks of ordering decaf cappuccinos, because I still liked the taste of coffee, and that's a journey that your taste buds have to go through. After a couple of weeks of ordering decafs, I accidentally ordered the real thing and I felt the palpitations start and I was edgy and I was jittery and I was hyper alert. And at that point, I realized what I'd been taking for so many years was a drug. And so I haven't gone back since. That's 10 years ago now. And the night shift thing is real. There are security guards, there's ambos, there's cops, there's so many people who are forced to battle with that. And then everyone who works in the office, all teachers, it's rampant within our society. It's your decision what you do. I decided to do a social experiment or a scientific experiment on my own body, and you make up the call, you make the decision for yourself. But it's refreshing to hear the evidence and the science behind what we all intrinsically experiment with in our own time and know puts us in a better space. So it is 12:01. Thank you, folk, for coming. Tomorrow is our final day. It's on stress and anxiety, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Thursday.